switching focus, though, let's talk about the CLG versus C9 series, because this one, while close and while it had many nail-biting moments, was really insanely maddening to watch from an analytic perspective, because it didn't seem like anything that was going on within these games had logical rationale behind it, but it was kind of players being arbitrarily picked off, like really poor positioning a lot of the time, wacky comps that shouldn't work, maybe working because of these reasons, and overall just a kind of unfortunate low quality of play.
Yeah, I think this was one of those games where you're like, yeah, that's the first game. That's like the first best of 5 they play, right? And then you hope that it slowly gets better as it gets closer to like semis and finals. Even like the drafts, it felt like both teams had like an idea of what both teams kind of wanted to play, and then they just kind of banded out, and they just had to like feel out what was working and not working throughout. Like you saw like the Zeri and like Enchanter support priority like go up a lot, and then even like towards the end, I think C9 finally figured out like, hey, we should just stop playing shit like, I don't know, I think they were playing like I think Ashe support and Nautilus, and they're just like, I'm just gonna pick like the safe, like I'm gonna pick Sivir and Lulu, and we're just gonna like ride this game out to the late game, right? And so I think it was like both teams kind of like trying to like figure out each other in like the most random ways until C9 towards the end just like, all right, we're just gonna pick the most brain dead thing and like get through it. And they started that way too. Like their first comp, despite the Ashe, was like you put Jensen on probably like his most standard champion, and it was like the most like like it was like
53 and 15 on Orianna and LCS.
Yeah, it was just like, hey, we're gonna have Trundle Ori as our core, and our side lanes are just gonna have Prio, and we're just gonna win team fights, right? And that core kind of just got lost a little bit later on when they're like pulling out like the Vi with Amumu and like Ari, and so yeah, I mean, it was definitely a little bit of experimentation. But it was fun to watch. So the thing I want to talk about this series is I'm talking to a CLG fan, like messages me for the first time in like years, right? Like our last conversation was like 2019, and he's like, "Oh my god, are you watching this game?" And like you're like, it was like game 3, and they're like, "Oh my god, it's finally gonna happen." And in game 5, when they finally got, I think they got banned for the first time, he's like, "We've finally done it." And I had like a message. I'm like, "It's when you believe where it's like gonna go wrong." And like 10 minutes later, he just messaged me, "Fuck," but. It was just kind of cool to see, and I feel like a lot of CLG fans had that reaction during the series where like, holy fuck, we're relevant in playoffs, we're taking C9 to 5 games, and then obviously it came crashing down, but we'll kind of see when like either a rematch happens or what happens to them in the lower bracket. But for me, it was like, I was rooting for C9 even though, or sorry, CLG, because it was just more fun for this team to kind of like put up this fight.
I think what was so infuriating about this match to me is that CLG, you can see the glimmers of them potentially being good. And by that, I mean, like, they do a really good job at times of warding. Like, they're really good at, like, playing around their vision, choking out vision on objectives, pre-placing wards before objectives spawn. And the problem is that once they have the information, the way that they throw games during team fights is like insanely shameful, or the way they get picked off before these team fights begin. Like Luger was terrible in this series overall. People might look and say, oh yeah, well, look at his like big scoreline in game 4. He was constantly out of position and getting picked off many times. Obviously, most obvious, clearly in game 5 of this series. But even some of the team fighting that this team shows, like when Palafox was team fighting into the Nocturne Kennen composition, and when the lights go off, he's like dashing forward when he can't see into melee range of Nautilus and getting killed. That was a team fight that CLG should have won because they forced the ults early if they just kite it out. But instead, Palafox goes in and dies randomly. So it's like they get so flustered in the heat of the moment that their team fighting is actually quite poor, or their positioning, like individual positioning, is quite poor, in spite of the fact that their macro like vision control and information is often good, which I guess maybe gives me some hope for this team, because you would hope they can correct their mistakes because they at least have the information to make the right decision. Yeah. But some of it was really lackluster.
Yeah. And I mean, when you kind of break down a lot of these games, right, it's like you're like layering first, like, are the technical skills of the players like up to par, right? And then you're looking at like the strategy, which is like their own formations and like their wording, and it's just general understanding of like macro and what they should be doing. And like I feel like CLG has gotten there. I think what they're missing was like the tactical end. It's like how do they respond to opponents? How do they like act in clutch moments? When you're like game 3, like what are the things that you're thinking? Because there was a point where like they're down, right? They're gonna potentially lose that game. Like what's gonna happen? Like and how you react as players, especially people who haven't played in playoffs. I think a lot of these players have never played in playoffs, or at least contracts hasn't for a while. It's like, how do you react to those moments kind of come out? And I feel like we saw a lot of that in CLG. It's like, they have like the basic foundation.
Yep. Dude,
and
that
it's like,
game 1 was the perfect instance of what you're talking about, because Cloud9 does the level 1 invade, right? Pushes them just slightly off balance, and then Contracts just completely collapses. His jungle pathing makes no sense after that. He's like, they invaded my blue buff. What do I do? He gets like outsmited at his own red. It's like he starts playing greedy. Then he could just do nothing for the entire game. And the rest of the team just folds. Like they could have actually, if they were a little bit faster, taken a level 1 fight that they had an insane advantage in. Instead, Dokla like blows his TP to do nothing. Poom trades Flash with Blabber at level 1, and then they just get preyed on in the bot lane, and Contracts is completely useless. And like, it didn't have to go that way. They could have done things in that early game, but they got so frazzled by this invade that they just shit the bed completely after that.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like, if you take the players aside and you show them this game and like what should happen, or if they're watching this game play from like the back, like from backstage, they're like, oh yeah, we should have just done X, Y, and Z. But it's like, that's the difference, like between knowing what to do and like reacting in the moment, that really changes during playoffs, because it's when you like ban out like your key picks from other teams. That's why draft during playoffs end up being super wacky compared to the norm, is because you're trying to play the game of like, what does he know, what is he good at, and what does he think I'm good at, and we're going to try to min-max for it, right? And that level 1, like those level 1s happen in every game at Worlds. But if you look at regional play and even other regions, like you don't see a lot of that. And it's more because normal season is about like solidifying your strategy and what you're doing, because you play against a lot of different opponents every week. And playoffs is when you're like focusing on one guy and really doing all this crazy shit. And I think CLG, we'll see what they look like in the next series, but I hope they have a lot more focus on like level 1s, figuring out not only just defending what enemy team is doing, but like actually attacking what their opponents are doing.
Well, also, I think even just mentally stabilizing if things don't go okay at level 1, because it was hardly a disaster, but the way they played it was just so incredibly terrified that they ended up losing the entire game, and it was purely in their own heads. I think they did a good job of bouncing back in subsequent matches, but disappointing that that's the way things started out. But that's the value of having the experience and veterancy on the roster that C9 has, and knowing that they probably should go for a level 1 against a team like CLG that will be easily destabilized by something like that.
Yeah, and it's like, I still appreciate that CLG was like, despite playing a lot of these situations poorly, or like Luger potentially getting caught, like at least they are putting themselves in situations where they are getting punished, because it's only that experience that helps you later on, versus like a rookie team who kind of goes in, expects to get smashed, and doesn't really do anything, and then just like falls over and dies. So this is still better than a lot of the alternatives I've seen in a lot of the playoff teams.
I mean, I think they should make a pretty strong lower bracket run. I anticipate that they're better than TSM, FlyQuest, and their first opponent, Golden Guardians. So I imagine we're probably going to see a C9 CLG rematch at some point in time. That's what I would predict. Whether that's going to, go CLG's way this time, I think that they'll be better prepared. And honestly, I think CLG should have won at least 4, if not all 5 games in this series. I think they had very real opportunities to win every single game that they played, if not for the misplays. And the other side of this coin is, oh my God, I expect much more out of Cloud9's players, not because of their current form. This is what I expected out of them in this particular match. But if I look at these names on paper, like, you can't make that teleport if you're Jensen in game 5 of a series. Like, there's no way. Cloud9 should have absolutely lost this game if I just get so frustrated about this CLG call, because yes, Dokla dies in the late game, but instead of just chasing people around, they had a wave at mid inhibitor. They could have just pushed mid and at least traded inhibitor for the Baron. I don't even think they would have had to make that trade because I think they could have threatened an end with the wave state that was there. So I don't think C9 could have even taken that Baron. I think they would have had to recall and actually defend their base. So the call to like chase people and Luger dying and getting picked off was totally wrong. Even when Dokla's dead, I don't think it matters that much because you already get them out of mid lane and you get the mid push.
My biggest pet peeve in League is people going for kills. Kills don't win you the game. They only win you the game if the death timers mean you can go and take the base. You always have to take the base. So if you can actually, if you're in a scenario where you're in control and you can get more ahead, that makes more sense than having a fight on even ground. Like, that doesn't make any sense, does it? I mean, unfortunately, in NA, that is just generally, like, think of all the discussion we had earlier. Like, that is the go-to number one problem. Like, the team who's in control of the game starts the Baron to bait the other team in, and then forgets they're baiting him in and just tries to do the Baron. It's like these things have got to get eliminated, mate. Because like this is like basic fucking like fundamentals of how you coach the team to play.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are saying like this is an NA problem. This is not like a
no, of course not. I'm just saying this is a example.
KT just lost the series.
The example I was given earlier was LTK did the same thing. Yeah, exactly.
This is literally like game. It's like a game 5. It's like mid game, things are even, and like they're not. The decisions being made are not rational, and you celebrate when you make crazy good decisions. I mean, even 2017 Spring Finals against C9, we only won because they came and fought our team at Elder, right?
Yes.
Like Jensen should never been in that position to echo.
No, exactly.
They just ran it down mid with Baron. It was already lost for us. And so like this is like, I don't know, widespread. It's like it's just what happens game 5.
Because my problem is, I just feel like people from playing in solo queue just still think the game is about fighting and killing Like, if there's one thing I love about the work of LS that he's brought to thinking about League of Legends, is that there's times when you can actually do nothing and get further ahead and just win the game by not doing something. And depending on which side of the coin you're on and what your comp is, sometimes you want them to be the ones making the move, not you. That's not always the case. But I feel like every single team, just on a like fundamental subconscious level, thinks they're the one who has to like, it's like, I have to score the knockout, I have to make the move to win the game, I have to kill this guy to it. It's like it's too reductive a way of thinking, in my opinion.
It's like a schema, right? Like the game overall has moved in a direction in the last 3 years to incentivize finding around objectives and conflict and like interaction between the two teams, right? Because Riot has pushed the game in that way, and so like it's hard when on one side you want to promote and push that as much as possible, and the other times like the 20% of the times where it doesn't make sense to do that. Like, how do you separate that, especially in like a key moment in like a playoffs game 5? And so yeah.
Like, put it this way, the other side of the same coin of where they're making a similar wrong decision, thinking fighting's all the game's about, is, I've always said this, every time I do a watch party, this almost always happens and I can't handle it, dude. I hate teams that sit under the inhib tower and they wait till the tower goes down before they start the fight. It's like, bro, if the fight has to happen, A, you can't be the one who lets him decide when it happens. You have to make it happen before so that you can do it while the tower's still up. And then B, because they always just sit there like almost praying they can just wave clear or something when they can't. Like, in that scenario there, like, again, you're thinking it's about, I've got to get the perfect fight. It's like, no, actually, you can actually take a worse fight there because of the situation you're in. Like, the amount of teams that make that fundamental error, again, I totally agree with the way. It's obviously very different if this was like a BO1 in regular season or a scrim, as opposed to like game 5 of your first big playoff match. Yeah, of course, that's going to make people's brains go out the window. And certainly it's not just this region, but these are like simple fundamental elements where the funny thing is, I think these are the areas I've always wanted coaches to put way more of their focus. Essentially, like, what are your decision-making trees? Not things like, this is the comp we play, and like in that VOD you did that one thing wrong. Those are like specific details. Those can go everywhere and get lost. The generalities are what I'm more interested in, like essentially game theory concepts.
I think the difference for me when we compare other regions, Parth, to your point about losing your head in game 5, is that when I watch KT versus Damwon Kia and KT like makes a play for Dragon Soul and they get Dragon Soul, right? They're making a play. And was it the wrong call? Yes, because Damwon, it just like storms down mid lane. They didn't have mid lane prio, they didn't have a mid lane turret, et cetera, and lose the game. But a lot of that was Damwon also using a Wukong to stop all their backs from going to the base. And KT was still going for an objective. The problem with this NA shot calling, right? And why it's more embarrassing to lose in this fashion is because CLG didn't make any play. They just ran into the jungle and got picked off randomly, and it wasn't actually a decision. It was like chase people into the darkness. It wasn't like, oh, we can get soul, or oh, we can make this macro play. It was like the worst decision you could make.
Yeah. And it's hard to say what led to it, because like I again, from being backstage, like sometimes there've been games where like one person dies and the other, like you have like the leader of your team being like, oh, this is where they're gonna start Baron, and so instead of doing that, we're gonna do X, Y, and Z. And maybe another guy was like, no, I want to do X, and so it might have been like a split call. It might have been like a moment of confusion. It's really hard to say what was going on at the moment to like lead to that, because again, those 5 players backstage looking at that, there's no way they make the decisions they made there.
Sure. Oh, of course not.
Yeah,
sure. I do think, by the way, that in itself ties into a problem that is a coaching issue in NA, though. I mean, every region, but just NA especially so, which is, that's another problem, Parth. If you only do the VOD review and you do it right after the game, they're all going to nail, oh, of course I shouldn't have done that. Yeah, I would do that differently. But the question is, what would they do when they're actually in that scenario? Everyone in hindsight can see it and everyone can admit the end mistake. But the question is, have they fixed the actual fundamental problem to next time do it right? You know, because the problem is that basically when these scenarios happen in games, I feel like I'm watching all those shit horror movies where it's like, what's that outside? I'll just go investigate myself. Oh, you stay here, but stay as a group, right? Hey, baby, maybe we should go off behind the tree. Like, it's like watching one of those horror movies. Like, they're making all the wrong moves. What are you doing? Well, you're all going to die to the zombies.
I know Parth has to go, but we'll leave it on this note because I want his opinion on this. This should be the way. Like, let's ignore all of the factors that make it difficult to play at NA, quality of practice, difficulty of finding good people to learn, how to lane properly or like play mechanically demanding champions against. In theory, proper macro should be the one thing that you can just watch the game from other regions or Theorycraft and teach people. So how is it that the macro is still bad? Because the macro should be the one thing that you can, as a coach, affect at a team-wide level and introduce your players to these scenarios. So how do you trade? Because this should be shadow boxing in a theoretical universe, drilling your players on different circumstances. There are things you could do, such as like if a player hasn't, wakes up in the morning and they haven't seen last night's LPL game, why not show them the game, pause it and say, what's the call to make right here and run these drills and then see how these things play out and theorycraft it so that they are in the moment of the game. What would the call be right now? Make the call now. You know what I mean?
I think that all of these things are being done to various degrees. It's just you can't take like tactical experience and how to react to certain things happening in the game is one of the hardest things to do. And most coaches do the thing of like, okay, this is the thing that happens. This is the situation that happens the most often. Let me try to generalize it and like put it into our playbook. And that's what most coaches do, right? That's like the goal. It's like, hey, this like early game is like the thing that's the most controllable, and so that's like what's trained the most, right? And then it's like different mid game states, that's what's controlled the most. And it's like the further you go on the game and the more extreme and different the situations are, those are the things that are hard to coach because there are things that happen less often, and coaches for the most part are coaching the things that happen the most. So I'm not saying that these things shouldn't be done better, but just based on like coaching and watching this region, like that is what every coach is doing. They're trying to recreate these situations that happen the most often and trying to generalize that into the playbook of the players. In some situations, you either miss or just can't hit. And sometimes, even though you want to hit it and it's important, like a post-game Baron situation, those situations just organically don't happen as many times in scrims. And so, yeah.
No, here's the thing. I think you make a very valid point there, because actually it reminds me of a famous chess analogy, which is that in the world of chess, in the same way as an LCS coach wants to win the next BO1, because everyone's just trying to win the next game and get ready in the short term, famously, people obsessively study all the newest openings and try and find the most cheesy, gimmicky one, because they think, oh, if I get a couple of pieces ahead, like I'll win. But what they obviously don't realize is if you actually fundamentally wanted to be a better player, what you would do is go and study the end game and figure out how to close out games that you're in, like just slightly ahead, a little bit ahead, a little bit behind. That's actually obviously how you fundamentally win the game. But as you say, it's a lot trickier because the scenario, same as with the pieces, is not going to be the same every time. It's going to be a different board at the end of the game. So it is essentially the most high concept coaching. Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.